Okay. Hi, everybody, and welcome to Perfecting Your Prose, Week 1. This week, we are looking exclusively at the smallest molecular unit of writing, which is to say the word. Because as you guys probably already know, like 80% of the game is about choosing the right words, right? As writers, we're constantly asking ourselves, what is the best word that I can use for this context that I have? So I'd like to start by looking at that process, about how we choose words, maybe to review the process that you already use for selecting the right words for your text, and then to go a little bit deeper to see how we can improve that word selection process so that the words you select are even more apt for your given situation. Let's start by thinking about how you would normally select a word. Let's say you have a sentence like this one. She was catching her breath just past the finish line, radiant, blank, and more beautiful than I'd ever seen her. A lot of times when you have a sentence like that, your mind will fill in the blank with several possible options, right? Because you know several different words that might fit in this context. Let's say we want to talk about how, she's just finished this race and she's been sweating, but it's not gross, it's like gorgeous, right? So we have several options for that. We could say sweaty, perspiring, glistening. We have several choices. And what you might be tempted to do then is to go ahead and choose a word based on the context that you're using it in. In this case, sweaty, if she was fishing a dead rat out of the attic, maybe she would be sweaty. And if she was lying under oath in court, she might be perspiring. But she's not. She's radiant. She's beautiful. So your mind will probably go to the word that you feel would most naturally enhance that quality of your sentence. In this case, glistening, right? We want something that's really positive, that's really attractive, that really enhances that beautiful image that you've crafted in this sentence. When you do this, what you're actually doing is choosing words based on their connotation. And connotation, if you don't already know, is the implied meaning of a word. This is different than the denotation, its dictionary definition. You can see the difference between these two things in words like, for example, childish and childlike. Both of these words have the same dictionary definition. They mean, literally, like a child. But childish has a negative connotation. When you describe someone as being childish, you're usually talking about them being selfish or immature or acting like a child in a negative way. Contrastingly, if that's a word, childlike is more used in a positive context, to describe someone who's innocent or pure or full of wonder, childlike wonder, something like that. So when you're using connotation to select words, you're helping yourself to choose the best word for your context by the implied meaning of the word, not just what it literally means in the dictionary. You can see that too in published writing. I'd actually like to show you a piece from a work that we'll be using a lot over those next 6 weeks from a friend of mine, Kirk Vonderheit. He wrote a book called Rabbit Slayer, and Rabbit Slayer is an urban fantasy about Alice in Wonderland, right? So you've got Alice and the Mad Hatter and the March Hare and the Queen of Hearts and all this great stuff in a modern context. And he was kind enough to let me work with him on an early draft of this book. So take a look at this excerpt from where Alice is fighting the Mad Hatter. Grabbing his arm, Alice twisted hard. His limb felt solid, unlike a normal human. The Hatter howled in pain, releasing the knife. And here, take a look at that first word, grabbing. This is a place where I think he's making a really good choice on choosing a word based on connotation, right? He could have said grasping, he could have said taking, but grabbing has a very forceful, violent, brutal kind of connotation, right? It implies that you are not just picking something up off a table, but taking it by force. And that, I think, is a really excellent word to use in this scene, since, again, it's a fight scene. We want something that sounds very forceful. But take a look at this last sentence again. The Hatter howled in pain, releasing the knife. This is a place where I suggested a change, because I think that release is not as powerful a word as drop. And you may be looking at that thinking, oh yeah, actually, I think I would like drop better. Or you may be looking at it like, oh, it sounds kind of 6 of one and half a dozen of another. I don't see a big difference yet. But what I'd like to do, regardless, is to show you where we get that idea of drop being more powerful than release. Because this is the second way that we can choose good words for our prose. And that is to say, to choose words based on their etymology. Etymology, if you're not already aware, is the study of the origin of words, of their history and where they come from. And if you know the history of the words that you're using, you are much, much more capable of using them to greater effect. So if you'll bear with me for just a few minutes, I'd like to give you the history of the majority of our English words and then show you how you can use that to make even better word selections or to use them to even greater effect. Ready? Here we go. In the beginning, well, in the beginning there was the Big Bang, but in the beginning there was Latin. And Latin is an ancient language that has been the parent, the ancestor of many of our modern languages, right? From Latin, the language of the Romans, we get what are called the Romance languages, like French, like Spanish, like Italian. These languages all have Latin as their common ancestor. We also have, among other things, further to the north and the east in Europe, we had a language that scholars now call Proto-Germanic, which was the common ancestor of many other modern languages today. This is the parent of languages like Norwegian, like Swedish, like German, like Dutch. So this, again, is a parent language, an ancient language that has given us many of our modern languages today. And these two are significant for us because in the year, by about 1000 AD, they had undergone a lot of changes and they had produced many offspring. Among them, Latin had started to evolve into French, in this case Old Norman French by about 1000 AD, and Proto-Germanic had evolved, among other things, into Anglo-Saxon, what we call Old English. This was a language spoken by the people who lived in Britain. And these two languages met in the year 1066. In the year 1066, October the 14th, what happened was that William the Conqueror, he was the king of the Normans, of the French, conquered the island of Britain. And this was called the Norman Conquest. So if he, he came across the sea. At the Battle of Hastings, he won the Battle of Hastings, which gave him title to Britain. He became its new king, and he imposed his language, that old French language, on all of the Anglo-Saxon people he found living there. So, by the way, you guys, if you have any friends who like to make jokes about the French, cheese-eating surrender monkeys, blah, 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 just remember, the French conquered the English so thoroughly that they actually gave us our modern language today. That's how hard they beat the English. Anyway, so carrying on. So in this year 1066, we had the collision of these two languages. And what that gave us was an enormous shift. Take a look, for example, at what we now call Old English, the language before the Norman Conquest. This is the language that you would see, for example, with Beowulf. And it is so old and it is so strange to us that we can recognize almost none of it. It looks completely different than anything we're used to. After the Norman Conquest, after the French came and imposed their language on the Anglo-Saxon people, the language underwent an enormous change. And that's what gives us Middle English, like what we see with Chaucer in the Canterbury Tales. This is still quite different than the language you use today, but if you look at this example here, you can see that this is, for the first time, recognizable as English. That continued developing into early modern English. That's the language of Shakespeare, for example, and it continued going on from there. So our language is really the fusion of these two parent languages. Our language is the child of two parents. We have the Germanic language on the one hand and the Latin French language on the other. And what I would like you to do is to take a look, for example, at one of our modern cousins, German, and see how much of an echo you can hear in these words. I'm going to use one that'll give you some context clues. Ready? Here we go. Pontius Pilatus fragte Jesus von Nazareth, bist du wahrhaftig Gottes Sohn? Und Jesus antwortete, du sagst es. And that might sound very strange to you, but I'll bet you can pick up some of this, even just from those context clues, because there are some words that are identical to their English counterpart, even though their spelling is slightly different. But the thing that I really want you to notice, and I'm going to read you one more example, and I want you to see how much of that echo, again, you can hear in this one. Vater, vergib ihnen, denn sie wissen nicht, was sie tun. Can you hear that? Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Even though none of those words is spelled the same way that it is in English, and some of them seem to have no relation, the grammar is very familiar to our ears. You notice how every word in that sentence is in the exact same place in German that it is in English. This is a one-to-one relationship here, which is very different from what you would get, for example, in Latin. Here's another piece from Latin. In principio, creavit Deus caelum et terram, dixitque Deus fiat lux, et facta est lux. There's not so much of an echo there, although you can probably tell where this is from. But you notice how, even though the grammar is quite strange to us and the order of the words is not the same, many of those words are probably familiar to you. Like, for example, when principio, right? That's where we get principle, prince, principally, all these words that mean first. Creavit, right? Creature, creative, procreate. This is the root of all of our, many of our words that mean create. Terram has to do with earth. So we have terrestrial, terrace, terrarium, terrain. So even though Latin does not give us so much of that familiar word order, we get a huge amount of our vocabulary from it. And that's actually typical of a collision of two languages like what we had with English in 1066. Usually what happens when two languages collide is that the dominant language, the language of the conquerors, will contribute the majority of the vocabulary, right? Over half of all the words in our English language come from Latin and French. The subordinate language, the language of the conquered people, doesn't contribute so much of the vocabulary. Germanic here only accounts for about maybe 25% of our English words, but the grammar is very persistent. This one reason, for example, like you can see in African American vernacular English, the words are overwhelmingly English, but some of those grammatical features, like, we be going or we was doing, those things come from African languages, and they persist even to this day. So, in a sense, we're actually really lucky because, again, our language is the child of two parents, and our two parents are very different. They don't necessarily have a close relationship. Maybe mom and dad don't live together, but we spend time at mom's house, we spend time at dad's house, and as tends to happen in those situations, we end up with twice as much stuff. We have synonyms, words that have nearly identical meanings that sound nothing alike, which for us as writers is awesome because that means we have, in many cases, twice as many or more choices as to what word we want to use according to what sound and what meaning we want it to have. From the Latin and the French side, these words that you see on this list tend to be more brain words, right? They're longer, they're more elegant, they tend to sound more sophisticated to our ears. The Germanic words, on the other hand, are what we might call bone words. These are very shorter, sharper, they're usually seen as less sophisticated, more primitive, more potent in a lot of ways. So if you've ever wondered, for example, why beef sounds nothing like cow, because the idea of beef, this abstract concept of this kind of meat, is from the Latin and French, which does a lot of abstract words. On the other hand, the cow, the thing you can look at and point to in the field, comes from the Germanic language. So it has a very concrete, specific meaning. And if you know about this duality of Latin and French, then you can use that to much, much greater effect. You can, for example, going back to Alice and the Hatter, look at release versus drop. And if you don't just magically know which one is Latin and which one is Germanic, that's okay, because we're going to talk about how to look that up. What you can do is just go online to one of my favorite websites, which is called the Online Etymology Dictionary, which you can reach by just Googling Online Etymology Dictionary or Etym Online. And you can actually look up not just the meaning of a word, but its history. So if we search for drop, for example, and we want the verb, if he dropped the knife, that was an action. We'll see here that this is from the Old English, dropion, to fall in drops or to fall vertically in the late 14th century. If we look at the word release, on the other hand, we can see what you might have already guessed, which is that it is from Old French, that it has meanings like release, relax. It's from the Latin relaxare, to loosen, to stretch out. And you'll be able, if you wanted to click on this second word that it gives you, see the history of that word, and the word underneath that, and the word underneath that. So this dictionary can take you a long, long way. More importantly, especially if you're writing historical fiction, this dictionary will show you where these meanings come from and when. For example, the word release is quite old. We see that it's from the 1300s. But certain meanings of it, like to release a press report, that's from 1904. Releasing a movie or motion picture is from 1912. Releasing an album, like in music, is from 1962. So this dictionary is an excellent one to use if you want to see when a particular usage of a word came into the popular vocabulary. So this dictionary can actually help you make those decisions. And if you were looking at this like, yes, okay, it would be better to say The hatter howled in pain and dropped the knife. But I didn't really need the etymology lecture to get there. I could have just got there on my intuition. That's definitely true. There's a lot of times when your ear will naturally help you make these choices. But what I really want you to see is that if you use etymology, you can use words in ways that will manipulate your reader's brain, if that doesn't sound too sinister. For example, check this out. Let's say you're writing a horror story about a serial killer in like an amusement park, right? And you're trying to think about what to call it. You could call it an amusement park or carnival or circus. We have several words that would work well here. You can use that etymology dictionary to help you make those decisions. For example, if we look up circus, right, we will see that it comes, it's from about the 14th century in reference to ancient Rome, from the Latin circus, meaning ring or circular line. That kind of makes sense when you think about it. Replied by Romans to circular arenas for performances and contests and oval courses for racing. See the Circus Maximus. Oh, cool. Okay, that makes sense. So if you kind of play around with this and you Google a couple of your different terms, you might be able to find something that you can really use. Look at this carnival entry right here. This was the time of merrymaking before Lent, from the French Carnival, from the Italian Carnevale, Shrove Tuesday, older Italian forms, so on and so forth. It comes from the old Pisan carnivale, to remove meat, literally raising flesh, from the Latin caro, flesh, which when you think about it makes sense, right? Lent is when we give up meat, so the carnival was the party before Lent, before you had to give up the meat. And if you decide, oh, that's interesting, here's this Latin caro, flesh, see carnage, what this dictionary will let you do, if you want to look up caro, right, and see everything else that derives from that word, you can do that. And you'll see here, carnivorous, carnal, carnage, carrion, all of these really awesome, powerful, kind of gruesome words that come from that same root. And if you know that, then you can use that in your story. Maybe we say, okay, we know that carnivale means to remove flesh, so maybe we want to take that and apply those words, carnivorous, carnal, carnage, and maybe do something with that. Maybe if in the story you misspelled the word once, like carnival with an E, that's going to make your reader's brain slow down to read that because it's an unfamiliar word, and that will have them pause long enough to really think about that carne root, right? So even if they don't know the origins of these words, that's going to suggest something fleshy, meaty, something brutal and gruesome in their minds. And they're going to get really excited, even if they have no idea why that sounds so good. And that's the big idea that I want you guys to come away with here, is that in these words have a history. They have hidden meanings. There's like little images hidden inside the words. And if you know how to crack those open and look at what's inside those words, you can use that in all kinds of really amazing ways. And that's what I'd like for you guys to practice this week in our course. So to review, we talked about connotation and denotation, right? We also talked about etymology, the history of English, the Latin and Germanic words and how those tend to line up, and how you can look up word origins and use them in your writing. Next week, we'll be looking at a couple of other ways to help yourself choose words. But for now, what I'd like you to do is go ahead and head down to the activities for this week and start practicing the things we've talked about. I would love for you to contribute to the forum as well. If you have questions about what we talked about here, or ideas that you want to share, I would really love to hear about that. So for now, go ahead and get started on the activities, and I will look forward to seeing you online. Thanks.